I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States. Thank you.
How will history judge Donald Trump?
What Donald Trump has done is got himself elected to the most powerful position in the world. And as he got there, he tore up the rule book of American democracy.
Most people have daydreams about doing exactly what he's done, which is come from nowhere and be the king of the world.
Perhaps one leader from our own past could offer a clue.
He was a man who became egotistical and ruthless and, frankly, a tyrant.
He was larger than life, hugely self-confident, a real self-publicist, and one of the most intimidating kings ever to sit on the throne of England.
It may sound far-fetched, but set the lives of Henry VIII and Donald Trump side by side, and the King's story sheds surprising new light on the Donalds. So in this film, we've assembled some of the world's leading historians, Tudor experts, and present-day Trump watchers to discover how their character and style of rule connects them across the centuries.
The thing that unites both Henry and Trump is power, and what power does to a man.
Both Henry VIII and Donald Trump, the story is exactly the same. You cross him, you're gone.
Henry VIII and Donald Trump governed by chaos.
Henry had pinned up around London that these were false fables, essentially that they were fake news.
Both are prepared to ignore conventions and norms and simply go barreling right straight through them.
And we'll see if the story of England's most famous king can help us gaze into the future and predict what the president's legacy will be.
I've always said from the very beginning of Trump's presidency, the way to look at him is the way that you would analyze a medieval monarch.
In June 2019, Donald Trump was invited to meet the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Surrounded by royal pomp and ceremony, the president seemed delighted.
I think what Trump really loves about the British monarchy is the combination of theatre, costumes, and history. Legitimacy through time.
For Donald Trump, royalty is something whose place is undeniable, who's permanent, who has a power that cannot be challenged.
Great woman. Great, great woman.
Ever since he took office, those trying to make sense of Trump have seen echoes of a regal style of rule.
Trump Watch, Thursday, June 7th, 2018. There's a memorable scene in the great film A Man for All Seasons when King Henry VIII of England steps off his boat into a long slog of mud. And seeing his embarrassing situation, his courtiers, all of them, jump into the mud with him. Welcome to the court of Donald Trump.
So help me God.
One of the great ironies is that the Founding Fathers, when they wrote the Constitution of the United States, didn't want another monarch. And what they seem to have got is one.
Because it's all about him. It's all about his moods. So everyone is waking up every morning, as they might have done at the time of King Henry VIII, is, what's King Donald going to say today? What's he going to tweet? Is he going to be in a good mood or in a bad mood? Now that is an astonishing fact for a 21st century leader.
Henry and Donald have a surprising amount in common. Both were second sons who lost older brothers. Both inherited and spent vast fortunes. Both were germaphobes. And both married mistresses and regretted it. But the similarities run deeper. History remembers Henry VIII as a powerful king. Yet his character was shaped by insecure beginnings.
Henry was a second son of a newly arrived king. Henry VII had won his crown on the battlefield, the Battle of Bosworth. He had a very tenuous claim to the throne, and so Henry VIII was part of a slightly fragile dynasty.
Henry VIII is the spare to his older brother Arthur. He was 6 foot, which is very, very tall for someone in this period. He was very athletic, but he's never supposed to be king.
When his brother Arthur died, it fell to Henry to follow in the footsteps of their domineering father.
Henry VII was quite a formidable and feared ruler, and certainly his son feared him very much.
We tend to think of him as a sort of grumpy miser, all in black, maybe very emotionally cold and very Machiavellian.
And Henry will certainly learn from his father habits of tremendous ruthlessness.
Like Henry, Donald Trump was the second son of a new dynasty. His father, Fred Trump, had built a New York real estate business from scratch. And Donald, too, was thrust unexpectedly into the hot seat. His older brother dropped out of the family business and died young of alcoholism.
I think one of the interesting things about Donald Trump is that he was not the heir. So he wasn't the person who was expected to take over the real estate empire, the carrier of the bloodline. And maybe that puts an additional pressure on the second son. That gives them an extra bit of competitiveness.
Donald's duty was made clear to him from an early age.
Fred Trump was the quintessential self-made man. I mean, he's been described as the Henry Ford of property. He made a lot of money by basically building tenement blocks for people who, didn't have a huge amount of cash in places like Brooklyn and Queens. Fred Trump was tough. And he always said to his children, you've got to be a killer and you've got to be a king. There is no failure here.
Henry ascended to the throne of England just before his 18th birthday.
Henry VIII always wanted to be better than his father. One of the most vivid illustrations was a portrait he commissioned from Holbein later in his reign.
He wanted to be the best king that England had ever seen. So he commissions a portrait in which he literally is bigger than his father.
Well, when Holbein first sketched it out, he put Henry and his father side by side, of equal stature. Henry told him to literally go back to the drawing board. Holbein then showed Henry VII in the background. He looks much more feeble than his son. He's having to lean on this pillar. And the inscription on that pillar reads, "The son was born to a greater destiny." This is Tudor propaganda, pure and simple. Henry is sending out a very, very clear message to the world. I'm a better king than my father.
Aged 25, Donald Trump also stepped forward to write his own chapter in the family's story. As the newly appointed president of Fred Trump's construction empire, Donald set his sights on a new kingdom.
What he really wants to do is to better his father, not just by making more money, but also by moving across the water to Manhattan Island itself. He wants to become the king of Manhattan.
Trump bought prime real estate rapidly and ruthlessly on cheap deals and built extravagant new hotels.
We're going to do something which is going to be a great stride forward for New York City.
Hyatt Regency is now an architectural gem for all the world to see.
To the rest of Manhattan, to see this young guy, kind of good-looking and glamorous, arrive and say, I believe in Manhattan, I believe in New York, and here's the building to prove it, that was a big deal at the time.
Here's a guy who did get New York talked about. He is the new player in town. He's the new kid on the block.
Just start pushing, and start pushing as hard as possible. So long.
Donald used his father's fortunes, spending lavishly and publicly to burnish his own image.
It stands 68 stories high, took 4 years to construct at a cost of over £100 million. The brainchild of a New York entrepreneur, Donald Trump, who modestly lent his name to the building.
Donald Trump was becoming successful in New York, and cash is king in New York, money matters. You've got to spend it on stuff that people notice. So, you know, he buys lots of things. He buys department stores, he buys football clubs.
Trump buys boats, he buys estates.
He buys planes and puts his name on the side. That had never been done before.
It was about showmanship. It was about display. When you're designing a brand, there's no place for shame. Spending money in an extravagant way becomes the badge of his success.
Trump moved into the gaming industry in Atlantic City, opening huge casinos, furnished with his trademark glitz and glamour.
This is a castle.
We called it Trump Castle.
He called it Trump Castle.
We kind of thought that was a joke, but he loved it because who lives in a castle?
A king.
5 centuries earlier, another natural showman with a genius for self-publicity had used a very similar strategy.
When Henry VIII comes to the throne, he inherits all of the coin that his father has been meticulously piling up for him. £375 million in today's money.
And he immediately set about spending it on tournaments, jousting, basically great parties.
Henry went off to fight wars, which cost vast sums of money. He wanted to be the most glorious person in the known world.
He built about 60 palaces, filled them with splendor and jewels. Henry was effectively building a brand. With all of this lavish expenditure, he was not just going to reign, he was going to rule.
For some people, size equals power. Power is the perception of power. If people perceive you as powerful and important, then you are. And that was the case for Henry, it's the case for Donald Trump.
But enforcing that power would take an iron will. And those who crossed Henry and Donald were about to feel their wrath. Like all powerful leaders, Donald and Henry needed close advisors they could trust. But in both cases, they chose them from outside the traditional circles.
Part of Henry VIII's genius was his ability to recognize ability in others. He liked surrounding himself with new men. He plucked these people from obscurity.
Henry VIII wants loyalty from these men. That's the other advantage of pulling from the sort of lower ranks of society. He makes them and he can break them. So people like Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Wolsey, giving them real power to negotiate things very much on his behalf, to the point that ambassadors refer to Wolsey as the Alter Rex, the other king.
What Donald Trump realized is that in order to be successful in business, you have to be surrounded by very loyal retainers, call them henchmen if you like, who were very good at kind of representing his business interests, who could also tell him about his opponent's dirty secrets, and who were slavishly loyal and ruthless. Roy Cohn was an extraordinary character. He was feared and known in Manhattan as the man you just wouldn't dare to cross. He'd worked with mobsters, he worked with politicians, he knew how to deal with Congress. Trump was brilliant in realizing that this guy would pave the way for him.
Donald and Henry also expected loyalty from the women in their lives. But as history remembers, it was often a one-way street.
Henry VIII is famously known as the king who married 6 times, and we know of 3 affairs. But one of the interesting things about Henry and women is that he's a total romantic. He loves being in love.
Henry fell in love with Catherine of Aragon, his older brother Arthur's widow, choosing her as his first wife.
Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon started very well, and in fact I think Henry genuinely loved Catherine. She certainly adored him.
One of the examples of domestic bliss that I like is that Catherine always sewed Henry's shirts by hand.
Donald Trump falls in love with Ivana, and who is a beautiful, Eastern European model. You can see the physical attraction, but also there seems to be a mental attraction there. She's attracted by his dynamism. They get married, they have children. It's really quite a happy relationship.
Yet these first marriages were destined to go wrong, and both Ivana and Catherine would learn the perils of upstaging powerful men in public. Henry went off to war again with his old enemy France, leaving Catherine in charge.
But there's a real threat. Because he's away, the King of Scotland invades. So Catherine has to order troops to go and meet the Scottish forces, and the English absolutely rout the Scots. And she sends a letter to Henry. She actually says, I think that this battle has been worth more than anything you can achieve in France.
But Henry took that as boasting. Actually, her victory had outshone his, and he hated it.
Worlds and centuries away, Ivana Trump would touch a similarly raw nerve. Ivana was by now working in Donald's business empire, and he put her in charge of relaunching the Plaza Hotel in New York.
And she refurbishes it, she starts running it, and she does incredibly well, and has a kind of opening party. To which Donald is invited as a guest, as a bystander, but not as the protagonist. And he can't stand the idea that he has given her something that she's made a great success of, upstaging him. He can't stand that. He cannot stand the idea of being upstaged by powerful women, especially if they're his own wife. That really is the beginning of the end of their marriage.
Eventually, both Donald and Henry turned against their first wives. Catherine hadn't given Henry what he wanted most, a son and heir, and their relationship came to an end with one of the most famous affairs in English history.
In the context of the tensions that Henry and Catherine had in their marriage, enters Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is young, she's very well educated, very cultured, charming, very beautiful, but in a sort of different kind of way, very dark eyes, dark hair. She seems to capture Henry's heart. The pile of love letters that we have from Henry to Anne are really illuminating, very passionate, very romantic.
Henry rapidly became obsessed with Anne Boleyn. He knew what Anne wanted. She wasn't going to be a mistress. She wanted to be queen. And Henry decided that he was going to try and put her on the throne, whatever the cost.
Henry would stop at nothing to marry Anne. Henchmen who didn't toe the line were cast out or killed. And when the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry broke off relations, made up his own rules, and put himself in charge.
He did this extraordinary thing. He moved heaven and earth to be with Anne Boleyn. He changed the very religion of the country in order to marry her. He broke with the Roman Catholic Church and established himself as head of a new Church of England.
Donald's own affair with actress Marla Maples didn't have quite the same impact on his nation's destiny. But it did pitch him into a very public multi-million-dollar divorce battle and revealed in him the same determination to win, whatever the cost. A side of Trump the world would get to know well in the decades to come.
When he started having his affair with Marla Maples, it gets incredibly messy and incredibly public. I mean, it's all over the tabloids in New York practically all the time. And it's deeply hurtful and deeply embarrassing to the wider family. The impression that some people got was that actually he quite liked it, because it was a way of getting back at Ivana Trump. It was the divorce of the century. A Manhattan fairy tale was turning to dust.
By the time Henry and Donald had reached their mid-40s, both men had shown a ruthless streak, and both had succeeded in marrying their mistresses. And Trump himself began to draw parallels with his illustrious predecessor, as the invitation to his 47th birthday party shows.
You're not kidding.
Yikes. Holy cow.
Wow. Was it really?
See, I think a lot of people would think that's horrible. I think that's actually pretty cool.
Unbelievable. He has a sort of woman at his feet. He's sitting on her.
I guess that's how he sees himself. I think Donald Trump would only really be satisfied if he was called King Donald. President doesn't quite cut it.
But as Donald would learn, one thing hasn't changed in nearly 500 years. When powerful men marry their mistresses, it doesn't always turn out well. In their mid-40s, both Donald and Henry hit fresh problems. The marriages they had battled to make happen began to sour.
Henry has been good-looking and praised for his athletic abilities. And then he hits this crisis point. It's in the year that he turns 45. He falls from his horse whilst jousting. It gives him constant and debilitating pain.
He becomes very sedentary, and yet he doesn't moderate his diet. He's eating about 5,000 calories a day. So the result of that is very rapid and colossal weight gain. His temper gets shorter and shorter. And this really was a huge contributory factor to Anne Boleyn's downfall. She miscarries for the third time. She's not going to give him a son, clearly.
Tiffany, Ariana Trump left a Florida hospital Thursday with her parents, Marla Maples and Donald Trump.
And the honeymoon was over for Donald, too.
The one thing Donald Trump can't stand is women, including wives, telling him to do stuff. He only eats Kentucky Fried Chicken, well-done steak, chips, burgers. Marla Maples starts telling him, eat less meat, eat more organic fruits and vegetables. It drives him nuts.
It was in the New York papers, their explosive falling out, day after day after day. There's one columnist who wrote about nothing else.
There's all sorts of reports of blazing rows between the two of them. Anne Boleyn can't seem to crawl back into favor. Henry is aggravated with her, and Cromwell, again, is given the role of getting rid of the wife.
Thomas Cromwell was the advisor who had helped Henry find a way to marry Anne. Now he would be pivotal in her downfall. Cromwell concocted charges of adultery, and Henry signed Anne's death warrant.
We all know that Henry VIII had wives executed, so we forget what an extraordinary thing it was. No Queen of England had ever been executed before. Suddenly, at this point, something turns him, something so fundamental that he will go to the point of having a swordsman come and behead his wife.
This demonstrates very, very graphically Henry's pathological ability to cut himself off from those who are no longer useful to him.
And it changes his relationship to power. Suddenly, everybody has to follow his line, and that means that he himself has stepped over into a new territory.
In the years that followed, both Henry and Donald would reinvent themselves. And it would begin with finding younger wives. Henry went through 2 quick, troubled marriages before choosing Catherine Howard, a wife some 3 decades younger than him.
The marriage to Catherine Howard was Henry's midlife crisis. She was really a trophy wife for the aging king.
And Donald divorced Marla Maples and married model Melania Naus, who was 24 years his junior.
The thing to remember about Donald Trump is that women are his form of self-rejuvenation. Along comes Melania, much younger, very beautiful. It's Donald Trump's way of saying, you know, I've still got my mojo. I can still be attractive. The brand isn't dead.
Henry and Donald had one challenge in common that few rulers have had to face. Both took power in the middle of a communications revolution, and both used it to their advantage. In Tudor England, the printing press was still a relatively new invention, and Henry, at war again, found himself under attack from a barrage of pamphlets.
Henry was getting a really bad press for the war with Scotland, thanks to really the beginning of newspapers. These news sheets were being printed, which conveyed news about the killing of women and children in Scotland, about the razing of Edinburgh to the ground. Henry was now at an all-time low in terms of his popularity. He had to do something to win back public opinion.
Henry VIII was someone who was very vulnerable to criticism. He reacted very fiercely to criticism. And so as his critics blast him in pamphlets, Henry reacts in kind by using the exact same means against them.
The pamphlets branded Henry a horrible monster, but the king developed an ingenious method of dealing with such attacks.
Henry had pinned up around London that these were false fables and tales, essentially that they were fake news.
Because they so poison the minds of people by writing false stories. Because you have a very dishonest newspaper up here. So here, you can have it, darling. That's all it's worth. Piece of garbage.
This is a strategy. This is a strategy used by people in power who want to show that criticism is untrue, that only they have the truth.
Fake news. Fake.
Centuries later, Donald Trump has tackled our own communications revolution and famously exploited it to the full.
There's a rather ironic moment in the Obama presidency when President Barack Obama sends out his first tweet. And it's like, look, guys, I can tweet from the Oval Office. Isn't that marvelous?
All right, I think I have done this properly, but here's the test.
Little did he know that 5 years later, his successor would build his entire candidacy, his presidency, on his ability to tweet. Why? Because in Trump's hands, Twitter becomes the most powerful tool of communications because it's direct to the electorate.
I call him Twitler. He's changed the game because he's made politics now an expression of personal will and a personality.
Twitter is an insight into his mind. He's incontinent with opinion. He's incontinent with Trumpness. It just comes out all the time. And increasingly, almost monarchical moments of magnanimity.
Donald Trump's personal helicopter descended onto the small airfield, greeted by a one-man Trump for president bandwagon.
Trump spent over a quarter of a century flirting with the idea of the presidency. As his power and profile increased, he attracted international attention. And one British journalist unearthed a rather bizarre connection between Trump and Henry.
I read somewhere that you don't like shaking people's hands because you're afraid of germs.
Well, not afraid of germs, Matt. I don't think it's a great custom. It's been proven, as you know, a person has a cold, a horrible cold, and they shake your hand. All of a sudden, 2 days later, you have a cold. You say, I wonder how that happened.
So if I shook your hand again, no fear?
No fear. No, it's not a fear.
You withdrew that very quickly, though. That was a quick withdrawal.
It's not a fear thing.
Well, I mean, it was a bit of a gimmick, the hand thing, because I didn't think it was actually true, but it turns out it was true. He is a germaphobe, and he didn't want to be, at the same time, seen as someone who's afraid of germs. Donald doesn't do fear, even with bacteria, even with viruses, which is good because if you want to run for president, as you might well do, then shaking hands is kind of part of the job, isn't it? His eyes almost sort of swiveled at the thought of these millions of hands he would have to shake in order to get into the White House.
Henry is the greatest hypochondriac ever to sit on the throne of England. He submits himself to a detailed examination by a whole team of physicians every single morning before he does anything else.
There was a real fascination for him with sickness and with avoiding it.
He won't come within a 5-mile radius of anyone who so much as sneezes.
You seem to have quite a thin skin. You get that? When I ended that interview, I said, if you do actually run for president, what would your campaign slogan be? He leant back and said, simple. Make America great again. And I chortled with laughter. I said, that is so simplistic. No one's going to take that seriously. I was so wrong.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
To cement their power and make their mark in history, Henry and Trump each had to sideline an old establishment.
What's really fascinating about comparing Henry and Donald is that they have both defined power on their own terms. You know, Henry takes on the most powerful institution in Europe. He takes on the papacy because he's fallen out of love with a woman. Donald Trump takes on the Republican Party because he wants to get into the Oval Office. He starts off with his candidacy being ridiculed, and he launches a hostile corporate takeover of this rather snooty club. And the minute you're unafraid to be outside the club, it gives you an enormous amount of power to tear the club down and make it your own. That is the secret of his power, ultimately. As his father said, be a killer, be a king.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Once they'd achieved the power they sought, both Donald and Henry would be merciless.
So help me God.
The advisors they had trusted to get them there could easily be disposed of. Steve Bannon had masterminded Trump's election campaign, but even he wasn't indispensable. When he was cast out of the inner circle, he compared his fate to that of Thomas Cromwell in Henry's court.
If you are an advisor, a henchman, working for a powerful politician or monarch, one thing you know is that one day you will be out. That happens to Steve Bannon. Well, for Trump, what does for you is disloyalty. You're disloyal to the leader, you're out. It's the same for Henry VIII, except he called it treason.
Henry could not abide any hint of disloyalty. Cromwell's enemies had accused him of trying to make himself king. It was all ridiculous, but Henry didn't care. Henry was so paranoid by this time. Cromwell found himself on the way to the Tower.
The executioner botches the job and hacks away at Cromwell while he's still alive, taking several strokes to finally kill him.
You do the Faustian bargain by working for these guys. This will be your fate.
Having dispatched their most trusted courtiers, both Henry and Donald became more isolated, unpredictable, and volatile. The last decade of Henry's rule was savage.
There very much is a sense that Henry is falling apart, and during these years, he also begins to feel that he is under threat more.
He was constantly paranoid about enemies around him and trying to get rid of them. This increases through his reign.
We know that Henry is personally responsible for some 300 or so executions. Treason has become this blanket term that will cover doing things that Henry VIII doesn't like.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me.
Both Henry VIII and Donald Trump govern by chaos.
Disordered departures have become the rule in the Trump administration, with aides and even cabinet officials pushed out at a record pace.
No bans, no walls, sanctuary for all.
It's this constant keeping people off balance because he's president of the United States and he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Henry VIII has his hand on the nuclear button. You can get your head cut off. You can lose your life.
Fear had become a governing principle in both the Trump White House and the Tudor court. Within a year and a half of his marriage to Catherine Howard, Henry learnt his younger wife was having an affair.
Henry is devastated when he is told of Catherine Howard's betrayal. He's completely humiliated, but that humiliation soon turns to rage. Catherine is arrested. She tries desperately to see Henry, to plead for her life. Henry refuses, and she goes to the block.
Henry's method of dealing with women was brutal, even by the standards of the 16th century. Trump's record is brutal by the standards of ours. In 2016, a shockingly explicit recording hit the headlines.
You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the... I can do anything. Hello, how are you? Hi.
Mr. Trump, how
nice
are you?
seeing you.
Pleasure to
Terrific.
meet you.
How about a little hug for Donald? He just got off the bus.
Okay.
One of the puzzles about Donald Trump's election as president is that so many of the people who voted for him would deplore his behavior in anyone else. The evangelical right doesn't approve of adultery, doesn't approve of grabbing women and forcing yourself on them, and yet they forgive Donald Trump for this. He gets away with it, I think, because he is completely without any sense that he shouldn't be doing it. He simply looks ahead, moves on.
In addition, since Trump came to office, over 20 women have come forward with accusations of sexual misconduct against him. Their testimony giving graphic detail. He has denied them all.
I stood up, and he came to me and started kissing me open-mouthed as he was pulling me towards him. He then grabbed my shoulder and began kissing me again very aggressively and placed his hand on my breast. And I tried to push him away.
My attorney and I are committed to making sure that everyone finds out the truth.
But an even darker accusation against Trump has been made. During their divorce, in her sworn deposition, his first wife Ivana alleged he raped her.
When the marriage with Ivana Trump is over, Ivana Trump comes back to Trump Tower to collect some of her things. He basically drags her through the apartment by the scruff of her hair and then rapes her.
Trump denied her claim, and Ivana later said that she didn't mean rape in a literal or criminal sense. She hasn't spoken of the incident since signing a non-disclosure agreement as part of her divorce settlement.
The one constant in Donald Trump's life is that his relationship with women is both the high point of his persona, but also the low point.
By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was feared by all.
Henry's final years are a time when actually he probably could justifiably be described as a tyrant, but for a reason. He's lashing out at others because of an intense paranoia that has taken over him. He's also a man tormented by pain.
Right up until the end, Henry is still executing many of those around him. Right in the last months of his life, he has a father and son committed to the tower.
What happens to you when you get that top office is you don't change. You never change. You just become more yourself. So you become an exaggerated, coarsened, more caricatured version of yourself, more threatening.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. This is a very different administration. Do not underestimate us, and do not try us.
And that's what we've seen with Trump in recent months, that his nativist rhetoric has become coarser, more aggressive.
Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. As far as I'm concerned, if you hate our country, if you're not happy here, you can leave.
What he's done is he's turned the underbelly of the American dream, which is very fragile, and he's turned it upside down and exposed what's underneath it.
It's to the beat of USA. There's this kind of hyper-nationalistic element that he has energized and he's legitimized. And when he's gone, they will look to somebody else to deliver the same kind of hit. And that, to me, is the scary thing, that he's the start of something. And that, I think, is what is so worrying.
When Henry died in 1547, England saw a decade of power struggles and short-lived rulers. In the end, it was his youngest daughter who proved to be his true successor.
It was not easy being in the court of Henry VIII. Elizabeth I, as she became, was very careful, even from a very young age, and she survived. She was a real survivor. And I think Ivanka Trump plays quite a clever game. She is not threatening to her father. She's supportive, and I think it's been quite cleverly done because Trump obviously listens to her, trusts her in a way that he doesn't to the other children.
So there he is on the state visit. Ivanka gets her own platform. She comes out separately. She is being road tested for the campaign. I bet you that in his own mind, he is convinced that she will be the first female president of the United States. And I think you'd be a fool to say that can never happen.
So how will history judge Donald Trump's time in office as the 45th president? And what can we learn from its verdict on Henry VIII?
Henry dominates our history. Even many centuries on, we're still talking about him. We all know about him. And I think that's exactly what he set out to achieve. He wanted to stand out as being not like anyone who had gone before or after.
I think Donald Trump will be seen as a moment in American history. He'll be seen as an aberration. It's a product of the revolution when the Republican Party turned to the right. You know, if we survive him, which I think we will, that's how he'll be placed in history. He'll be a valuable lesson.
The thing about history's verdicts is they often change. 50 years from now, people may be saying, you know, Donald Trump, yes, problems, some of what he did was very wrong, but he did stand up to China. We don't know, but it may well be that the verdict on Trump is going to shift just as it has done on Henry VIII.
The entire American system was set up to prevent George Washington from becoming another King George. What Donald Trump is saying essentially is that I want to reverse that. I want to be King Donald. He wants that kind of power because who knows what he'll do with his second term. The world is waiting like an audience, you know, at a great season finale. What is the star going to do next? And frankly, we have no idea.
And this time we're going to finish the job